Welcome to the webinar, everyone. I'm Rich Bentley. I'm VP of Product Marketing for Stormforge. Really excited to be here, kind of getting things going and moderating today's discussion. So we're talking about something that we see as a growing challenge for organizations, especially for platform engineering teams, and that is around empowering developers to really self-serve their infrastructure needs, but doing it in a way that still ensures efficiency. So we have some great panelists here. We'll introduce everyone in just a minute here, but I want to kick things off with a quick polling discussion. Let me start that up right now. And yeah, take a look. I want to get feedback on, understanding how big of an issue this really is. So the question is, how close to right-sized do you believe that your cloud consumption is today? And oh, I don't think I kicked it off. Hold on. Sorry, this is a new tool for me, but I'm trying again here. All right, there we go. Should be up now. So yeah, if you take a minute and let us know your thoughts on that, but I'm going to go ahead and get started, and we'll come back to the answers in just a minute. When we talk about this problem, I really love this analogy. Asking engineers or developers to define resource requests and limits for their Kubernetes applications, it's a lot like asking your kids to take only what they need at a candy store. Usually not something that works out too well. Or if you put it another way, if you give them a choice between small, medium, and large, and we hear that a lot, they're going to choose large every time because they want to make sure that their application performs and is reliable, but that's not necessarily the best choice in terms of overall cloud consumption, cloud costs, resource usage, things like that. So we've got a few answers to the poll. Not bad, could be better. A couple answers there. We have a lot of cloud waste. If you haven't answered it, go in and let us know what your situation's like.
The audience is a bit slow today. Come on, guys, you can do better.
No worries. We'll leave it up there for a couple more minutes. So we see kind of three key reasons for the challenge that we're going to talk about today, and I'm just going to talk through this a little bit to set up the discussion here with our panelists. But first, resource decisions have been pushed down, and they're now made really at the level of individual engineers. Second, Kubernetes resources and skills are hard to find, as I'm sure a lot of you know. And third, Kubernetes itself is really complex. So let me just talk through each of these in a little bit more detail. So first, if we think about how things have evolved over time, we've gone from a situation where resource decisions were very centralized, and they were very like big decisions, right? We were talking about adding data centers or servers or storage. And now we're completely on the opposite end of the spectrum. We're completely decentralized. We have individual developers who are making decisions at a very micro level, right? At a container or a pod level. And that may work okay if you're talking about a couple of services, but when you extend that to hundreds or even thousands of services, it becomes unmanageable really quickly. And small inefficiencies can multiply and become really massive waste. Second, most organizations are struggling to find talented engineers that really understand Kubernetes. And if you do have some of those resources on your team, you ideally don't want them spending time, configuring, tuning, tweaking, troubleshooting low-level kind of Kubernetes settings, right? You want them to work on more strategic activities, things that add value to the business, like innovating, automating repetitive tasks, eliminating toil, proactively presenting issues rather than reactively responding to them. And then lastly, you have the complexity of Kubernetes itself, right? When you deploy an application on Kubernetes, you have to decide on a number of settings, as we've been talking about, things like CPU requests and limits, memory requests and limits, replicas, and you have to make those decisions for every pod or every container. And then there are application specific settings as well, heap size, garbage collection settings, and so forth. So if you think about it, there's really essentially an infinite number of combinations, and every combination of settings results in a different outcome. Outcomes being the cost of running the application, the resources used by the application, the performance of the app, the reliability, and so forth. So it's very difficult to really kind of make those decisions as a human being and to make them in an intelligent way. So with that, we've got a few more poll questions. Looks like we're kind of across the board. Nobody is as efficient as they could be, which is not surprising. A few people not bad, could be better, which is good to hear. But then a few people that are kind of on the lower end of the spectrum as well. So I'm going to kind of start the next poll, and I'll leave that up while we introduce our panelists as well. So let me see if I can make that happen again. Sorry. All right, try this one. Okay, there should be another poll there right now. So basically just looking to get your feedback on, what you see as some of the biggest causes of cloud waste in your organization. And if the choice, if what you see on the screen there is not what you think of as the biggest cause of cloud waste, put it in the chat and we'll talk about that as well. But while you're doing that, I want to kind of kick off the panel discussion and have our panelists introduce themselves. So Jan, do you want to get us started?
Sure, thanks. So my name is Jan. I'm based in Karlsruhe. It's in South Germany. And I work for Innovex as a backend engineer and architect. So Innovex, it's actually a combination of innovation and excellence, which are our goals. And we are a consulting agency working across all industries in Germany. So clients might be car manufacturers, food industry, aerospace, banking, yeah, whatever you can think of, media industry.
Nice.
Yeah, and I got in touch with Stormforge through a client, and very excited to join because Stormforge asked me to join the discussion and tell some share some insights from real projects where we use the tools from Stormforge.
Awesome. Well, great to have you, Jan. Franz, you kind of kicked things off, but why don't you take a minute to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Rich. Yeah, I'm France. I work for Giant Swarm. We extend platform teams in companies like Vodafone, Deutsche Telekom, Adidas, by running the cloud native environment infrastructure for them, so they can focus on innovation. I myself am responsible for everything from customer acquisition, onboarding, and growth, and that's where, especially in the growth area, I had more the strategic discussions with customers around how they can advance their cloud native maturity. And the more mature they get, naturally, the more bigger the cloud consumption, bigger the tickets they have to pay. And that's where it's getting really exciting for those companies to then take a closer look at cloud consumption and how that can be optimized. So yeah, it's a very hot topic for quite some customers. Thanks for putting this webinar together, Rich.
Yeah, great.
And yeah, we're looking forward to the discussion,
Yeah.
and also see how that will change for companies in the upcoming year with economic uncertainty and and how companies want to respond to that.
Awesome. Great to have you here, Franz. And then last but not least, Niels.
Yeah, so my name is Niels. I'm based out of the Netherlands. I work for Stormforge now, I think 6 months, so fairly new to the company. I cover basically the EMEA region together with some of the other folks in the region. Yeah, I get the opportunity to run proof of concepts, for instance, with people like Jan and other really smart people in the industry. So learning a lot and yeah.
Awesome.
Having a blast, basically.
Great to have you here. Great to have all of you here. Got a great deal of relevant experience on the panel here. So just looking at the responses to the second poll that we ran, it looks like, again, it's kind of mixed results. Nobody said that they don't have a cloud waste problem, which is good because otherwise you probably wouldn't want to be here. But a couple of responses around engineers having to guess, over provisioning to reduce issues, and then one answer each on the lacking of the skills and resources and the complexity. So Makes sense, but let me back up a little bit. And when we talk about right sizing or optimization is a term that you see a lot nowadays. Let's just talk about what does that actually mean. What would optimal look like when it comes to cloud and cloud native environments? And I don't know who wants to get us kicked off. Don't make me call on you guys.
Well, maybe I can start. The way I see it and the way I discuss it with customers is, optimal obviously is, basically that's what the promise is of public cloud and cloud in general is that you pay for what you use, right? And as we have seen in the poll, people tend to over provision resources quite a bit just to make sure that they get sufficient performance, that they get the experience that they're expecting. And over provisioning results in higher costs than necessary, basically. So optimal would be to actually pay for what you use and what you need, in my opinion. And that's obviously it's not only about cost, but it's also about performance, right? You want to get the performance that you expect from a scalable platform. So that's the other end, basically. So cost and performance definitely important. And obviously you want to do this in an automated fashion, right? So you don't want to put a lot of manual trial and error, put a lot of effort into getting these results. So that's optimal from my perspective.
Yeah, makes sense. Jan, does that match up with what you see with customers you work with, or anything that you would add to that?
Yes, of course. I would like to add a few points. So in the cloud, you can have like two different models for payment. If you use like completely serverless technologies like AWS Lambda, you cannot optimize much apart from like execution time or maybe memory. But often, especially with Kubernetes, we have some fixed size resources, which then can be used to some extent, like 0%, 50%, 100%. So optimal for me is kind of a trade-off between two extremes. So on the one hand, you have like 100% usage, like full saturation of your resources. So with a server, you like could cook some eggs on it and it's completely utilized. And on the other extreme, you have perfect stability, availability, and or perfect throughput, whatever your application does. And you can't have both because if you have perfect like availability or throughput, then you would need some headroom if your workload is varying. So you cannot have 100% saturation. And so optimal is kind of to find a good trade-off between those two extremes. And especially for the big cloud providers, you also need to find the best payment model for your use case. So I think especially the serverless solutions, they are good for like smallish use cases. But if you use like you have a very big application, then the cost just gets through the roof, and you need some other way to pay for those things. And
yeah, great points. I think the trade-off, topic is a really good one as well, because there is always a trade-off, right? But it's also about making that trade-off in the best way possible and minimizing the waste, that as much as you can while you're making that trade-off. Yeah. Franz, anything to add to that before we move on?
Yeah, I think like probably it's like from a technical perspective, it is really the trade-off. But like then there are let's say certain aspects of it that are probably more difficult to judge because they are more relevant to the business perspective. So if you look at Adidas, for example, they basically they cut the loading time of a website in half. And that resulted in 20% more revenue conversion in their online shop, and that's something that basically adds complexity to the whole, because then you basically can look at let's say at the performance of the application, the loading times and stuff like that, but then you also need to add information like how much business does it generate more, so it becomes even more complex to actually make that balance. Between let's say a perfectly performing website, but then also like what is the business outcome to it, or as Jan mentioned, also the downtime. Like, basically, if you run into a badly performing website, or even an app going down, then that's basically could be even more critical to environment than over provisioning. And I think that's something that also depends a lot on the technology that you use. So you may have teams that deploy applications that are less cloud native, and may take a long time to scale up. So if you want to then scale up different replicas just to serve the requests, that might, these are all the things that you need to build into your calculation to come up with this optimal performance. So it's, let's say the technical, the business aspect of balancing out, and also like taking into consideration how much time you actually have put into developing the applications, and how important innovation is. So before we went online, again, I had a little chat about, kind of, what are the use cases you typically have. And I think, that's where you've got large organizations that are probably more mature, that, already know kind of the innovation rate may be slower. But then you've got, companies like Adidas or whatever that I think the last number I saw was 4,000 deployments each day. So innovation is really rapid, and every delay and every minute you spend on optimizing is like something lost in innovation. And that's where, like associating the right right resources, people resources, to the right subject is, I think there are many different dimensions of right balancing it.
Oh, that's a really great point. I'm glad you brought that up too, as well, because if you're taking, having your people spend all their time on trying to optimize and tune applications and look at cloud costs and things like that, then they're not adding value necessarily to the business. So let me dive a little bit deeper into the challenge. I talked a little bit about it already, and we had the polling question on it, but the title of our event today is around how platform teams empower dev teams to right size. So give me your perspective on why aren't most dev teams empowered to do that today? What's the problem with that? Jan, do you want to kick this one off?
Sure. What I noticed when I worked for like larger companies is that every person in the company has a specific toolbox. So developers write code, Scrum Masters do retros, managers, I don't know, staff people, or just move people, or tell other people how they should fix the problems. And when there's a problem or an issue, everybody will work with his or her tools in the toolbox, sometimes even in parallel or against each other. So for this example of the platform teams and the dev teams, so assuming you have some platform teams probably managing some big Kubernetes cluster, and the dev teams can deploy their workloads there, then the platform team has administrator access and has probably the best insights on how the resources are used. So they have the toolbox to like optimize resource sizing. And the dev teams, they deploy their applications. They are very like focused on the business logic or whatever use case they need to solve, but they don't have the insights the platform teams do. They don't have the administrator privileges mostly, in most cases. And it's hard for them to optimize, but it's also hard for the platform team because they don't know about the use cases. For them, it's just Docker images running. And that's why from my point of view, it's hard to tackle this problem without tooling or like even organizational incentives to minimize cloud costs. For me, it's amazing that I think many clients I've seen, they are very focused on the costs for consultants, of course, makes sense. And it's probably more expensive to pay the consultants than to like pay the cloud. But from like when the project gets larger or grows, the cloud costs also grow, and suddenly you're like spending 5 or 6 figures per month, and it's completely oblivious to the controlling section of the company, because all the resources, it's just Terraform code mostly, or some other way to provision them, and it's at the fingertips of the developers, and not and they don't have any benefit if they save money. They only get problems if things aren't stable anymore. So I think these like controlling platform teams, dev teams, they need to work together also in an automated way if possible, and like make sure that the cloud cost isn't wasted.
Yeah, it's a great point about incentives. Franz, how about you? What have you seen in your work?
Yeah, I would just like, second Jan immediately. It's like, what is the motivation behind it? And, and I think that's the biggest challenge that I think as a dev team, you basically want to deploy fast. You want to, want it to scale fast. You want your test environment scaled to the same as the production environment, things like that, that basically make you innovate faster and run without problems, because it's you. Typically, if you're in the DevOps environment, that is pinged at night if something goes down, and and that's kind of something that kind of doesn't really motivate you to go beyond in optimizing your resources and that spend. And at the same time, I think what we see a lot is that development teams typically don't have that. It's kind of the cognitive overload is like they already know the code, the application, the business logic, as Jan mentioned, and now they also need to understand how the infrastructure works and how it can be optimized and how to resolve issues and get visibility into it. And from my perspective, that's where platform teams fail a lot in organizations, is that they basically provide a basic level of let's say platform. And then the rest is on top of the developers to take care of. And this is something that, kind of is where the maturity of the platform teams needs to advance tremendously in providing that visibility, that guidance to the platform, to the development team, so they can then, take the right decisions for their applications and give recommendations, provide transparency, talk to management, make sure that they're aware, talk to the PO of the team to make sure that there's time set aside to optimize and do these load tests and whatever that give you that data to then basically help build these predictions that help you right size the environment. So I think, as Jan mentions, like, that collaboration needs to be very strong, but it also requires quite some maturity on the platform team side to provide that guidance. And it's also time. And that's something that we see over and over again. It's like the platform teams are so small and they're like, kind of reinventing the wheel by building that infrastructure with Terraform and other things that, basically keeps them from being that consultant or that guidance to the development teams to help make the right choices.
Yeah, you made some great points there. We keep putting more and more on the dev teams, right? First it was DevOps, and then DevSecOps, and then FinOps, and everything else, right? We keep kind of pushing that stuff over the wall, but without the proper support and tooling and systems and information and all that kind of thing, it's just it's not fair to and training, not fair to keep asking that. Niels, how about you? Anything to add on this topic before we kind of move on?
I mean, I think it's all been covered. It's about incentive and responsibilities and insights. So yeah, nothing to add really.
No worries. I like your comment, Jan. DevSecFinOps, DevSecFinBizOps. Probably we'll add biz in there somewhere.
Oh yeah, this of course.
So we touched on it a little bit, but I want to get into kind of the business impact side of things, and what is the impact on organizations that don't have the processes and tools in place to support and empower their dev teams to right size cloud consumption. And Niels, why don't you get us started on this one?
Yeah, sure. So I think if you don't have any of that, it's basically like you showed in the slides in the beginning that you're either gonna have really rapidly growing cost of your cloud consumption, or you're taking risks from a performance and stability perspective So there's a lot of things that can that can go wrong if you don't pay attention to this. The other thing is that we haven't really touched on that, but if you're over provisioning, if you're consuming more or you're requesting more and reserving more than you're actually using, there's also the environmental perspective of it, right? So people talk about that more and more. I've been to a lot of trade shows recently, and that's a question that comes up as well, right? So what about wasted resources? How's that going to impact the image of my company? That's actually something that came up, like, I think with 60% of the people we talked to. So that I think that's more and more important as well. But yeah, you're just wasting resources and
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of, like you mentioned, a lot of organizations now have environmental sustainability initiatives, and I mean, just the magnitude of the problem. I'll just point out, we do a survey every year about asking people what their perception is in terms of how much of their cloud spend is wasted, and the last 2 years the answer has come back 47-48% is wasted. And so if you think about that in terms of not just cost, but also the resources, the carbon footprint of data centers and in cloud providers and things like that, it's a pretty massive problem. And that's just perception, right? I know in the work that we've done at Stormforge with customers, we've seen anywhere from 30-60%, even up to 90% in some cases, where it's just over provisioned and wasted resource. So definitely a big problem, environmental cost as well. But Jan, what else do you have to add to that in terms of the business impact with customers that you've worked with?
There's also an like indirect, not very obvious impact, but I noticed that especially with internal people at the customer. So if you kind of know that like 50% of your cloud money is wasted, and it feels bad for a developer, especially if you are getting a salary from the company, because it feels like the company is throwing money out of the window, and that's not very good for employee like happiness or how they view their employer. It's probably hard to measure, but I think we should take this into account.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, nobody wants to feel bad about the work that they're doing or feel like the work that they're doing is not effective or efficient or anything like that. So it's a really good point.
Yeah.
Franz, how about?
And I think there are many of these discussions that are happening internally. Is like, it's quite frustrating for all participants, because at least in one of the large telco companies that I work together with very closely, they basically they've got their yearly plans, and they go over their basically estimated cloud consumption. And that's where the platform team then goes back and says, well, so where would you be in a year? I was like, we don't know. Like, yeah, we should be at the same level. Yeah, it never turns out that way. You increased by 30%. So if we add 30% now just to cover the budget, that actually means then that's where the team freaks out naturally, because where should that money come from, and how do you argue, and then it goes back and forth between the platform team, the management that needs to provide the budget, the developers that try to kind of find reasons why it's they're not incentivized, as Jan mentioned, to kind of to optimize for that. So where do you spend the time? And every time they spend time on optimizing, it's it's basically they're not fulfilling the innovation or the business stories that business is requesting. So I think in the end it comes down to ugly discussions internally where you basically cannot resolve. You don't have the data to take the right decisions. You can't argue with any side. Now, the platform teams is really putting a lot of pressure on the development teams to follow the recommendations. But again, the responsibility is in the development teams for the applications to perform perfectly. So, it's something that I think if you don't have the right tooling in place, if you don't have the right approach, if you don't have the process in place, if you don't have the incentives in place, it actually becomes really, really difficult for anyone to win in this game. And I think that's what we're saying is like, basically someone needs to cover the cost, and in the end, probably people are just happy paying it to the cloud provider, which is fair enough, but it doesn't. It's not a sustainable story. Not for the financial health of the company, nor for the ecological health of the world.
Yeah, it's great points, and bringing it all back to cost. Especially now with the way kind of the economy in the world is kind of going, and I know probably a couple of years ago we didn't hear a lot about people trying to cut cloud costs, partly because it was sort of like the whole cloud native world was still fairly new and they were just kind of getting ramped up. But now as a lot of these cloud native apps are scaled up for like day 2 operations, but also with the pressure from the economy and things like that, I think cost is going to become a bigger and bigger factor as we go forward. One challenge that we hear about a lot, and we mentioned it a little bit up front, is the skills gap, right? So Kubernetes in particular, but a lot of these technologies in the cloud native world are relatively new, not to mention the complexity that we talked about, and there just aren't necessarily enough people with the depth of knowledge that's needed to really effectively run these systems and do it in an efficient way. So I want to throw out the question of, what are some things that organizations can do to kind of go about starting to close this gap? And Franz, I know this is probably near and dear to your hearts at Giant Swarm, but why don't you?
What I've said is like call Giant Swarm. No, but yeah, I think like that's something that is a very strong driver right now, as you mentioned. Is like we just don't need to look at the numbers. It's like cloud providers are growing at 40% per year. If you want to scale at least appropriately, you would need the market to grow about 40%. So I don't see software developers just show up at that numbers anywhere in the world, and I think this is something that you can see more and more, and that's where you need to really make a choice. What is the stuff that really advances you as a company, and what is the stuff that you basically is repetitive, and you can help or get other people on board to do that for you. If something is essential, if it's a small environment, like there are certain situations where it probably doesn't make sense yet. But as we said, it's like in the beginning, motivation is great. Innovation drive innovation. Cost isn't that important. The more mature the organization gets, the more important it gets for them to really control the environment, become scalable, fully automated, ideally. Where basically you can optimize not only the cloud spend but also the resources you put in place. So I think this is where more and more companies need to focus on, is really like instead of wasting time in rebuilding their cloud native stack that other companies have gone through, in troubleshooting, in updating, in automating, in Terraform and other things, really see if there's not something out there that you can reuse, so you can then spend time on the more value generating elements of it. And I think this is like probably the number one question for you to make a choice on. And if you actually get more and more of your internal staff focused and trained and supported by external companies, I think this will also give you the flexibility that you are looking forward to enjoying over the next, let's say, 2 years, maybe, where you need to be able to respond to trends very quickly, but at the same time, if something changes, you need to make that choice and be able to react to it also very quickly. So I think adding that flexibility and that outside help is something we see as a trend. We've been at KubeCon Valencia, and has been the predominant factor. In the past, we always ran into companies, no, we're doing that ourselves, everything's fine. Now where it's like, no, we need to get people on board. So we've got companies out there that run 200 clusters with Kubernetes that are now looking for help to get people in to the organization that can run it for them, just because it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I think your point about like not reinventing the wheel is a really good one, right? I think a lot of organizations, they like to think they're completely unique and different than every other organization, but the truth is a lot of this stuff has been done before, right? And Niels, I know you work with a lot of customers that are kind of going through this process of migrating to cloud native and all of that. What's your perspective on the skills gap?
It's interesting because when I joined Stormforge, I started meeting people like Jan, for instance, that are eating and sleeping this stuff. And the cool thing is, although there's a lot of people with a lot of knowledge, they all have different opinions on some things, right? So it's kind of hard to decide what is the best way to go about some things. But for instance, Francis mentioned that there's customers that have 200 clusters, right? That has some benefits, having multiple clusters or many clusters, making it easier to manage from some perspective. But on the other hand, why would you need so many clusters? That makes it more difficult to manage as well, right? So there's probably not a silver bullet on how to make it easier, but I think that's one of the things, right? People make different decisions. That's just really interesting to me. That why would you want to have so many clusters? And I just talked to somebody earlier this week, and he said we try to get everything on one cluster, which also seems kind of ambitious. It was a fairly large environment. So there's a lot of decisions to be made, and there's no one silver bullet, I guess. But probably Jan can talk about that way more than I can.
Well, yeah, the skills gap. I feel it too, because as a Kubernetes agency, we are constantly booked. So it's like a lot of clients in Germany, and maybe also because it's a new toy here. Well, one way to tackle this is a very traditional way: just train your employees and just tell them why it makes sense to them. And so, for instance, I took one training from the Linux Foundation, which Innovex offers. It's the Kubernetes application developer training. It's like 3 days, and I'm like using most of the knowledge every day for like 1 or 2 years now. So it really pays off to like invest a few days in training, and it's even not that complicated in the end. I think the problem is, as Rich mentioned, that sometimes developers just have cognitive overload. So they need to focus on so many things, but just give them like a break for 3 or 4 days to play with new technology, and most of them will love it because that's what we are passionate about. So apart from hiring, of course, you can train people. And what Niels mentioned, and Franz, I can second that, that we are suffering from not invented here in a very massive way. I think because most developers are just passionate about building their own tools, and it's hard to like guide that passion in the right direction. But maybe also because it's a young industry. So if you compare it to like nuclear energy industry, I think most of the nuclear power plants in Europe are unique. So every power plant is like a unique engineering artwork. And it doesn't matter what your opinion is about nuclear energy, but it means that this type of energy production is very expensive, and it's very hard to learn. Oh yeah, and it takes 20 years to build, exactly. So when it's finished, it's old, And with software, it's the same. So we have new tools, I think, every few years, or with web development every 6 months, and it's hard to keep up. And like every client I've seen so far with Innovex has a unique stack. Of course, there are some repeating elements, and sometimes they even build the same tools, which they think are unique but are not, because we've seen it at another client already. Yeah. Especially for like the monitoring, alerting, scaling, those like operation things.
Yeah, Yeah, for sure. I've seen that a lot as well. So let's talk about tooling a little bit more. We've touched on it a little bit, but when we go back to the problem of right sizing and optimizing and becoming efficient, empowering dev teams, what are the types of tooling or technologies that are available? And obviously, Stormforge, we're a bit biased in this because we have a tool of our own to help with this, but Niels, why don't you kick it off, and what are the types of tooling that you see that are helpful for this problem?
Yeah, so like you said, obviously we're a bit biased at Stoneforge, but we can go around the whole buzzword bingo, but what we leverage obviously is machine learning to solve some of these problems. Um, so what we do is we look at all the metrics that get collected in clusters, in Kubernetes clusters specifically. We feed that to the machine learning, and then have machine learning optimize it for whatever it is that you want to optimize for. And um, in production environments, often that is for resource consumption. So we just have machine learning decide on what would be a good recommendation, what would be a good setting for instance, requests and limits in your Kubernetes cluster, so that you only request what you actually need. And that's based on actual usage and historic usage. So that's one way. One way to approach it is just to right size all the pods in your environment. And the cool thing is, with things like machine learning, you can do this at massive scale, right? So you just point at the namespaces, for instance, that you want to optimize, and it will just do its thing. It can be thousands or tens of thousands of pods. It doesn't really matter. The other way that we leverage machine learning is to optimize based on experimentation, basically where we take a load test, run that against your application in a pre-production environment, and then again measure performance results, and then have different trials run with different settings to see what the optimal settings is, for instance, for a particular number of users, or the way to get the lowest latency of your application or the highest throughput. So yeah, that's basically what Stormforge does with the optimized platform that we provide.
Cool. And Jan, you've worked with a lot of customers, a lot of different technologies. What would you add to that in terms of tooling that really helps with this problem?
Yeah, actually, I've used two platforms from Stormforge. So the classic like performance testing extensively, and also what Niels mentioned, Optimize Pro, where you define an experiment, have an arbitrary set of parameters, and then run hundreds of experiments if you want to do it. While you don't need to be at your machine at that moment. It just runs in the cluster, and you get some interesting results on what you really need for memory or heap size or whatever for your application. It was very useful. Apart from that, a good tool is actually Grafana and cost monitoring. I've seen a few clients do that, especially if they are not in a growth phase, so the set of features is more or less constant, then they assume that the cloud cost is also staying the same, except it might correlate with the growing of, I don't know, clients using the platform, of course. And then what they do is they look for outliers. So they notice that, okay, we have a big jump in costs here, the platform team notices, and then they start to ask questions. It's a very simple traditional way, but works, especially for mature companies.
Yeah, I think getting visibility is an important step, right? Of just understanding that you have a problem, and then I think the machine learning and tools like Stormforge come in to tell you, well, what to do about that problem, right? I've identified I have an issue. What can I do to fix it, or to make it more optimized? And Franz, anything to add on this topic before we move on to our last question?
Yeah, I was wondering if it actually needs two elements of it. One is the visibility aspect of just making the teams aware of how much overspend there is, or potentially is. Like, just making sure that it's aware, like the teams are aware, the POs are aware, the management is aware of it. Just, so basically there is a bigger appreciation of the work that needs to happen and go into it, and then basically also seeing how that naturally is reduced over time. But then at some stage, I think that insight becomes more difficult to sell because like you're optimizing and you're getting always closer, so that discrepancy is getting smaller. And I think the other aspect is, kind of the automation around it. It's like, basically, ideally, I think if you've got the possibility to, set the variables to a certain element of, let's say, you basically need to go beyond or reach a certain threshold and then automatically scale up or down or whatever. And then, basically you've got that algorithm, as you said, Niels, to basically have that machine learning, that, that experience. It's really taking that off the shoulders of developers and automatically setting that as CRDs or whatever in your GitOps environment. So, basically the developers feel confident that, something takes care of that instead of them having to manually right size it. But I don't know, like, there are probably technical drawbacks to that too. So that's something I think that, people will need to discuss with you as experts around how to deal with it.
Yeah. I think automation is a really important topic, and there can be a danger there, right? If you're automating a bad process, you're just kind of multiplying that, or if you're automating inefficient pods, then you're kind of just multiplying the inefficiency as well. So you have to think about it the right way. But great point to add in there. So last question, and go ahead.
Sorry, just a question is like, what I see is like, once you have cloud native applications that are really not cloud native ready, but like, built cloud native fashion, naturally it's a lot easier to spin up replicas and other things. What's your guys' experience with, let's say, applications that have been made cloud native, kind of just deployed into containers and run there? Because I think that's where a lot of, kind of the challenge comes in terms of responding to peaks or, like also resource consumption. We've experienced that Java applications will consume whatever resources you have whenever they spin up. And then, basically it takes maybe sometimes 20 minutes to spin up just for an application. And these are things that, kind of kill many of these ambitions. Is that something that you typically see as a challenge? Maybe Jan or Niels?
Definitely, yeah. Especially the startup times, which depend on the tech stack to some extent, are like a classic discussion between developers and platform people or operations people. Because most of my operations colleagues, they really like Golang because it's so fast. And most of my developer colleagues really like the JVM world of Kotlin or Java and Spring Boot, because there's so much already in place with the framework, and you can focus on the domain of the business. And there we need to find some trade-off, because especially the Spring Boot pods, for me, they take like 12 or 14 seconds to spin up and start to be ready. And the Golang pod, maybe 1 second. And that sometimes makes the difference when you have like peak loads.
Yeah. Niels, any other examples? Or I guess anybody, kind of the last question I wanted to ask was around, we've talked about different examples of customers you've worked with, but any other examples or quick stories that you wanted to share about other companies? And Niels, why don't you start on that?
Sure. Just to go back to the previous question really quick. It was an interesting point that Jan brought up. We actually run a Java workshop for people to attend, and one of the things that we do with Optimize Pro is, because that's one of the experiments that we can do fairly quickly, is optimize for startup times of monolithic Java applications. And what we show is that if you take the default settings, I think it was like 35 to 40 seconds to start up an application. And then we have the machine learning, I think it was roughly 100 trials or 100 different settings. And that includes the settings for the JVM itself. And we reduced it, I think, to like it's still 10 seconds or something, but there was quite a substantial reduction in startup time. So that was quite a cool experiment that we run during the workshop. Yeah, so we have a number of customers that use our technology, and obviously, well, luckily, very happy with it. One of them is a pretty cool one. They offer like a distributed workplace for communications platform for workplaces. And due to COVID, obviously, they grew quite substantially with everybody working from home. Which was obviously very good for them, but what they noticed that their cloud costs, they were rising, very, very fast as well. I think it was like 40% year over year that they started paying more for running the platform, and they didn't really optimize, their applications yet. So they did use HPA, so horizontal pod autoscaling for bursty workloads. So they were just adding more replicas of the same services. Like you said, if you haven't optimized them, you're basically replicating or multiplying the problem. So what they did is they actually optimized using our platform the resources per pod. And what they saw was, a reduction of cost. Initial, it's always kind of like a bandwidth because we don't know exactly yet what the savings are going to be, but the initial thoughts were somewhere between 40 and 60% savings. So that was quite substantial, and we have a number of those customers and examples, and the savings are always quite substantial.
Yeah, cool. So we're almost at the top of the hour, but I want to make sure Jan and Franz, any last words or any last stories to share before we wrap up?
Yeah, something I wanted to add about like what dev teams can do is you need to definitely choose your battles. So I've met a dev team once and they were like optimizing their GitLab runner size, but the GitLab runners were like 2% of their whole cloud bill. And it's sometimes, I think as humans, we get caught up in side shows where it's not important to optimize. It's actually the same with climate change. You need to like take all the big things where you can save CO2 emissions and not like focus on like all the small things. And it's the same with cloud costs. So start where the problem is the largest.
Yeah, good advice. Franz, how about you?
Yeah, I think I think nearly everything has been said. It's like really start where the savings are the biggest. Also see if you where to like smartly spend your time, and if it needs to be your time or someone else's time, and then basically I think the biggest opportunity that we have, and we see that in these companies, like giving that visibility into how much the cloud spend is and going on that journey, I think is something that where you learn a lot, and have that discussion internally, and suddenly I think you end up being a lot more mature because you just have spent time thinking about it, I think like if you've got more time, the easier it is. I think that is where you guys come in as well as us. That's where we are very happy to help. And with that, thanks so much
Awesome.
to this round of discussionists.
Yeah, no, it's been great.
It's been great.
And I just, before we close it off, I just want to give a couple of things that folks can do to learn more. One, we've got a white paper that we just published a while ago that kind of goes into detail on Kubernetes resource management and all the different things to think about when it comes to that challenge. So check that out. And then Neil's mentioned this. We are running a series of optimization workshops. So these are like full day or 6-hour type workshops where we go in depth on solving some of these problems. So we've got one coming up on Java in just a couple of days here. and then a couple that are .NET specific as well. So definitely check that out, and we hope to help you out. So with that, yeah, I want to thank all of our panelists. So Jan, Franz, Niels, thank you so much for sharing all of your insights and sharing some of your experience. I hope it's been helpful for everyone, and have a great rest of your day wherever you are.